Beneath the mountains of ancient Anatolia once stood a forgotten superpower, the Hittite Empire, a civilization that rivaled Egypt and Babylon, then vanished into legend for over 2,000 years. Their story is one of gods and kings, of war and peace, of brilliance and collapse. From the forging of iron that reshaped warfare to the world's first peace treaty carved in clay, the Hittites changed history, before disappearing without a trace. Join us as we uncover their lost cities, decode their ancient tablets, and rediscover the legacy of a people who shaped the Bronze Age world. If you're fascinated by lost civilizations, ancient technologies, and the mysteries buried in time, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth. Together, let's keep the memory of the past alive, one forgotten empire at a time. Beneath the rolling plateaus and quiet valleys of central Turkey lies the ghost of a forgotten superpower, an empire that once stood shoulder to shoulder with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. Its name was spoken with awe and fear, its kings corresponded with pharaohs, and its armies thundered across the mountains of Anatolia. Yet for more than 2,000 years, the world forgot it ever existed. This was the empire of the Hittites, the lost masters of Anatolia. The story begins around 1600 BCE, in a land of stone fortresses and fertile plains. Here, a confederation of mountain tribes rose to become one of the most formidable powers of the ancient Near East. They carved their capital into the rugged hills, a city called Hattusa, guarded by walls of massive limestone blocks and gates adorned with lions and sphinxes. From this stronghold, the kings of the Hittites would command an empire stretching from the Aegean to the edge of Mesopotamia. But who were these people? Their origins remain shrouded in mystery. Some say they came from the north, Indo. European wanderers who tamed the highlands of Anatolia. Others believe they emerged from the soil itself, children of the storm god, bound to the thunder and the sky. What is certain is that they built a civilization unlike any other, disciplined, inventive, and deeply spiritual. The Hittites were masters of diplomacy as much as war. Their archives, preserved on thousands of clay tablets, reveal treaties, trade agreements, and letters exchanged with the great powers of their time. They were pragmatic conquerors, absorbing the gods and customs of those they subdued, blending cultures into a grand mosaic of belief and law. It was not fear, but order that held their empire together. Yet for all their achievements, the Hittites did not leave behind grand pyramids or hanging gardens. Their legacy was written in clay, fragile, silent, and easily lost to time. When their cities fell and their temples turned to dust, so too did their memory. For millennia, historians spoke of Egypt and Babylon, but of the Hittites there was nothing, not even a whisper. It wasn't until the late 19th century that the silence began to break. Archaeologists exploring the Anatolian plateau stumbled upon strange ruins and undeciphered inscriptions. The stones of Hattusa began to speak again, and what they revealed stunned the modern world. The rediscovery of an empire so vast, so advanced, that it rewrote everything scholars thought they knew about the Bronze Age. The Hittites had stood as equals to Ramses of Egypt. They had forged the world's first known peace treaty. They had mastered iron before almost anyone else. And then they vanished. What could erase a civilization of such power, leaving nothing but scattered ruins beneath the earth? Famine? War? The wrath of gods they once worshipped? This is the enigma of the Hittites, a civilization that rose from the mountains to rule an age, only to be swallowed by history itself. Their story is not just one of kings and battles, but of memory, how the world remembers, and how easily it forgets. Because sometimes the greatest empires aren't the ones that endure, but the ones that are rediscovered. Long before their empire stood in stone, before the great walls of Hattusa guarded a mighty realm, the ancestors of the Hittites roamed the wild, windswept mountains of Anatolia. They were small, scattered tribes, herders, warriors, and sky-watchers, who looked to the heavens not just for rain, but for meaning. In the deep rumble of thunder, they heard the voice of their god. And it was this god, Tahun, the lord of storms, who would give birth to an empire. In the ancient world, survival depended on understanding the will of nature. To the Hittites, lightning was not chaos. It was command. They believed that storms were messages from the divine, signs of favor or fury. Their myths told of celestial battles, the storm god striking down serpents, reclaiming the skies, restoring balance to the world. These stories weren't just tales, they were blueprints for life, teaching them that strength, discipline, and devotion could tame the chaos of existence. As the tribes grew in number, so did their ambition. From their mountain fortresses, they began to descend into the fertile plains of central Anatolia, uniting under chieftains who claimed the favor of Tahun himself. Each victory was seen not merely as conquest, but as divine approval. The storm god's chosen people were expanding, and with every new settlement, every stone laid, they believed they were fulfilling a sacred destiny. By the 17th century BCE, one name began to echo among them: Labana, the first great king, the unifier of the Hittite lands. Under his leadership, scattered clans became a nation. His successors, carrying titles like Great King and My Son, would rule with both divine and mortal authority. They were not just kings. They were intermediaries between heaven and earth. Every ritual, every law, every battle began with prayer to the gods of thunder and sky. The Hittite pantheon soon became vast, absorbing the deities of conquered lands. But at its heart remained Tahun, the ever-watchful storm god, depicted on ancient reliefs with a lightning bolt in one hand and an axe in the other, standing atop mountains, commanding clouds and rain. In him, the Hittites saw not only power, but protection, a reflection of themselves, fierce, enduring, and unyielding in the face of nature's wrath. Archaeologists have found inscriptions and carvings that speak of these beliefs, festivals where priests and priestesses offered wine, bread, and sacrifices to ensure the favor of the skies. The rhythm of their year followed the rhythm of the heavens, the sowing of crops, the forging of treaties, the waging of wars, all aligned with the turning of celestial seasons. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Hittites' devotion was how it guided their politics as much as their faith. They believed that to defy divine order was to invite ruin. Even kings could fall if they angered the gods. It was this deep spiritual structure, the belief that authority came from something greater than man, that held their world together for centuries. From the thunder's echo over Anatolia to the inscriptions etched in stone, the Hittites carried the voice of the storm wherever they went. Their god was not distant. He was alive in every flash of lightning, every roar of the sky. And so, guided by thunder and faith, they rose, from scattered mountain tribes to the architects of an empire. For the Hittites, power did not come from man alone. It came from the storm that shaped them. In the heart of Anatolia, surrounded by rugged hills and whispering pines, the ruins of Hattusa still breathe with the echoes of a vanished empire. Once, this was no mere city. It was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of temples, fortresses, and gates carved from living rock, a seat of kings, a treasury of gods, and the beating heart of a civilization that stretched across continents. When the sun rose over Hattusa, its walls blazed like bronze. From afar, travelers saw a city born of the mountains, terraces and citadels rising layer upon layer, as though the land itself had taken shape to guard its people. Each wall was more than defense. It was a message of permanence, an unspoken claim that the Hittites had mastered not only the sword, but the stone. The Lion's Gate, with its twin beasts sculpted in defiance, stood as a warning to invaders. The King's Gate, crowned with a warrior in divine armor, declared that those who ruled here did so by the favor of the gods, and beyond them lay the sacred core, the temple of the storm god, where priests kindled fires to honor Tahun and his divine consort, the sun goddess of Arina. Inside these sanctuaries, the air was thick with incense and chant. Clay tablets recorded every offering, the weight of the grain, the number of cattle, the hour of the ritual. The Hittites believed that to maintain order in the heavens, they must mirror it on earth. Every act of devotion was part of a grand, cosmic balance. Yet, Hattusa was not merely a city of worship. It was the empire's mind, the seat of bureaucracy, diplomacy, and law. Within its archives lay tens of thousands of clay tablets, treaties with Egypt, letters to foreign kings, records of taxes, prayers, omens, and ancient prophecies. The words pressed into those tablets, still preserved after 3,000 years, reveal a civilization obsessed with order, bound by law and guided by reason as much as faith. It was here that the Treaty of Kadesh, the world's first known peace treaty, was stored, the product of negotiation between the great powers of its time, the Hittites and the Egyptians. In these halls, scribes and translators worked tirelessly, bridging languages and nations, preserving the fragile peace of a turbulent world. But Hattusa was also a city of silence. When night fell, the torchlight danced upon its colossal gates, and the wind whispered through the valleys where sentinels once stood. The same hills that had given the Hittites strength also sealed their isolation. For centuries, Hattusa was both fortress and prison, protected by mountains, yet cut off from the sea, from trade, from escape. Archaeologists who later unearthed its secrets were struck by the precision of its architecture, drainage systems, underground tunnels, and storehouses that showed not just might but method. Hattusa was a machine built for endurance, yet no empire endures forever. When the storms of the Bronze Age collapse swept across the Near East, Hattusa, that stone heart of empire, fell silent. Its gates were burned, its temples abandoned, its people gone. The city that once ruled half the ancient world was reclaimed by grass, wind, and time. But even in ruin, Hattusa remains alive. The carvings still tell their story, of kings and gods, of treaties and faith, of humanity's eternal dance with power and loss. Beneath every fallen wall lies a reminder. Civilizations rise not only on strength, but on the fragile belief that their order will outlast the storm. And though the empire is gone, Hattusa still stands, a city of stone, keeping the secrets of a world that refused to be forgotten. There are few sounds as haunting as the scratching of a reed on wet clay, the birth cry of history itself. Long before ink, before parchment, before paper carried our words, there was clay, cold, heavy, and eternal. It was here, in the hands of Hittite scribes, that language found its permanence. In the dim light of a Hattusan archive, a scribe kneels over a tablet no larger than his palm. The air smells of dust and oil. The soft glow of a lamp flickers across thousands of other tablets, stacked neatly, row upon row. He presses the stylus carefully, wedge by wedge, line by line. Each stroke carries meaning, a fragment of a civilization's soul, its laws, prayers, treaties, and dreams. This was not just record-keeping. It was the act of preserving existence. The Hittites inherited writing from the Sumerians and Akkadians before them, but they transformed it into something more, a vast network of memory that tied together their sprawling empire. Theirs was a world built on tablets, clay libraries filled with royal decrees, trade agreements, omens, rituals, and the whispers of diplomacy between kings. Each city kept its own archive. Each archive, a reflection of order. Every transaction, every sacrifice, every law was etched into eternity. Clay, the earth itself, had become the empire's most trusted witness. Inside the royal archives of Hattusa, archaeologists uncovered over 30,000 tablets, a staggering collection of words frozen in time. Some tell of floods and famines, others of war and peace. One tablet records the treaty with Egypt, the first written peace agreement in human history. Another preserves hymns sung to the storm god Tahun, prayers asking for rain and mercy. Together, they form a heartbeat, the pulse of a civilization that refused to vanish without a trace. These tablets were not mere records. They were the foundation of law, the language of kingship. P. The Hittites believed that justice itself was divine, that every decree issued by the throne was sacred. The king shall not harm the innocent, one law declares, a sentiment centuries ahead of its time. Through these writings, we glimpse a society that valued order and fairness as much as conquest. We see letters from queens to foreign rulers, reports from generals, lists of offerings, and warnings from priests interpreting the stars. The clay was their internet, a network of minds connected by language, held together by faith. And yet, these tablets reveal more than politics or piety. They expose the human heart. We read the fear of a soldier missing home, the hope of a farmer praying for good harvest, the grief of a king pleading with the gods to spare his son. Across 3,000 years, their words still reach us, unbroken, immortal. The scribes of Hattusa likely never imagined their work would outlast empires. To them, writing was duty, a sacred service to the king and the divine order. But in preserving their words, they preserved themselves, their thoughts, their beliefs, their world, sealed in clay and buried beneath the Anatolian soil, survived when palaces turned to dust. When archaeologists first cracked open these ancient tablets, they weren't just reading Hittite history. They were listening to a voice resurrected from silence. The cuneiform signs, once indecipherable, revealed a civilization that had vanished yet somehow remembered itself through the language of clay. In every wedge and stroke lies a truth older than iron or empire. That knowledge is power, but memory is immortality. The Hittites may have fallen, their cities reduced to ruins, but through these fragile pieces of earth, their voices endure, whispering still across the centuries in the language that time could not erase. In the highlands of ancient Anatolia, under the glow of 1,000 stars, smoke rose from the furnaces of destiny. The air shimmered with heat as sparks leapt from the heart of the forge, the sound of hammer striking metal echoing across the mountains. Here, the Hittites did what no civilization before them had truly mastered. They took the bones of the earth and forged the future. While Egypt built in stone and Babylon ruled with gold, the Hittites discovered a far more powerful element, iron. It was born in fire, tempered by mystery. To the ancients, this new metal seemed alive. It glowed red like the blood of gods, and hardened to a strength beyond bronze, the metal that had defined an age. For centuries, others had touched iron only from the heavens, fragments of meteorites worshipped as divine gifts. But the Hittites learned to summon the stars from the soil. Deep in their mountains, they mined iron ore and smelted it in roaring furnaces. It was a process of patience and precision, feeding the fire, controlling the air, reading the color of the metal as if deciphering a divine language. The result was nothing less than revolutionary. Iron was stronger, sharper, and far more abundant than bronze. With it, they could arm legions, fortify chariots, and shape tools that never dulled. It was not just a discovery, it was a transformation. From the forges of Hattusa came blades that gleamed with a cold brilliance. The soldiers who wielded them marched with confidence, born of superiority. Against bronze armor, Iron cut cleanly. Against the weapons of their enemies, it did not bend. The balance of power in the ancient world began to shift, silently, irreversibly, in the Hittites' favor. To possess iron was to command the future. And the Hittites guarded this secret with the same intensity as they guarded their gods. The knowledge of smelting was sacred, passed only among trusted smiths and royal workshops. Foreign emissaries could see the finished weapons, but never the process. It was the empire's most guarded alchemy, a science of transformation, both material and spiritual. Iron changed not only warfare, but civilization itself. With stronger tools came deeper plows, faster production, better trade. The empire expanded its influence, its armies clad in the cutting edge of innovation. The chariot, once the pride of Bronze Age battle, became unstoppable when fitted with iron-reinforced parts. It was as if the very earth had armed them. But every discovery carries a shadow. The same forges that elevated the Hittites also bound them to fire's hunger. When the furnaces dimmed, when trade routes faltered, and ore supplies thinned, the secret that had made them great became a burden they could no longer sustain. Yet, even in decline, their legacy endured. Their methods spread, carried east to Assyria, west to Greece and beyond. The Iron Age dawned, not as a sudden spark, but as an ember passed from Hattusa's dying fires. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would find the remnants of those furnaces, their slag still blackened by ancient heat. Within them lay humanity's first true step into modernity, the moment when earth, fire, and human will combined to reshape history. The Hittites may have fallen, their empire swallowed by time, but the world they left behind bore their mark in every blade, every plough, every tool that shaped the next age. Their mastery of iron was more than technology. It was the dawn of endurance, the moment humanity learned to forge not only metal, but destiny itself. From fire they rose, and through fire they changed the world forever. In the heart of the ancient world, where empires often ruled through terror and tyranny, the Hittites built something different, an empire of law. Beneath the shadow of Hattusa's towering walls, in quiet chambers lit by flickering oil lamps, scribes pressed reed styluses into wet clay. Each mark they made carried the weight of civilization, not the will of a single king, but the rules that would bind him as much as his subjects. The Hittites understood that power without justice was a flame that burned itself out. They saw law not as a weapon, but as a covenant, an agreement between rulers and the ruled. And so, on thousands of clay tablets, they recorded one of the most remarkable legal systems the world had ever seen. Unlike the harsh decrees of Hammurabi, which demanded death for nearly every crime, the Hittite code was tempered by mercy. Their laws spoke of restitution instead of revenge, of compensation instead of cruelty. A thief might repay what he stole. A wrongdoer might restore what he damaged. The Hittites sought balance, not blood. It was justice crafted not from divine fear, but from human reason. They believed that even the gods valued fairness over fury. To them, law was sacred, a reflection of cosmic order, a mirror of the harmony that kept storms from destroying the sky. Their storm god, Tarhunt, ruled not as a tyrant, but as a judge, weighing thunder and silence alike. And their kings, though mighty, were seen as stewards of that divine equilibrium. At the center of this system stood the king, known as the My Son. But even he was bound by the laws he enforced. His decrees could be challenged, his decisions could be questioned. In a world of absolute monarchs, the Hittite ruler walked a narrower path, one of duty, humility, and service to the people. The tablets of law were not merely administrative tools. They were the conscience of an empire. Within those clay records were laws for every aspect of life: trade, marriage, property, even the treatment of slaves and foreigners. Yet in these details, a deeper humanity emerges. Hittite slaves could own property. Foreigners could marry citizens. Women could inherit land and appear in court. These were not the customs of oppression, but the early echoes of equality. When disputes arose, officials would gather in open courts, hearing testimony beneath the gaze of gods and men alike. Justice was public, deliberate, and often surprisingly lenient. The goal was restoration, not destruction. To break a law was to disturb order. To make amends was to restore it. And in this balance lay the secret of their endurance. For centuries, the Hittite Empire thrived not through conquest alone, but through trust, the trust that law would stand above violence and fairness above fear. Their scribes preserved these codes carefully, pressing every verdict into clay, baking it into permanence, ensuring that the truth would survive even when the empire itself did not. When archaeologists uncovered these tablets thousands of years later, they found more than laws. They found a reflection of ourselves. In the quiet reason of the Hittites, we glimpse the birth of civilization's moral backbone, the belief that power must serve justice and not the other way around. The Hittites may be long gone, their palaces reduced to dust and memory, but their spirit endures wherever justice is written, debated, and defended. They were not merely warriors or kings, they were architects of conscience, the first to build a world where law, not fear, ruled the hearts of men. In the golden twilight of the Hittite Empire, when gods still walked among the dreams of kings, one woman rose above the expectations of her age. Her name was Pudu-Hepa, queen, high priestess, and the mind that steered an empire through the tempests of war and peace. Born in the sacred lands of Kizzuwatna, Pudu-Hepa was not of royal blood. She was a daughter of the gods, trained in the temples of Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. Her life changed forever when she met the Hittite king Hattusa III, not in the glitter of a palace, but on a battlefield. Legend tells that the king, weary and wounded after years of civil strife, saw her in a vision, a radiant priestess tending to the wounded beneath a sky of fire. When he found her in the flesh, he knew the gods had chosen her to stand beside him. Their union would transform the empire. Together, they ruled not as husband and wife, but as two halves of one divine mandate, the sword and the spirit, the king and the priestess. Pudu-Hepa's name would soon appear beside her husband's on royal seals, treaties, and decrees, a mark of shared authority that was almost unthinkable in her time. From her chambers in Hattusa, she governed the vast machinery of empire with calm precision. She wrote letters to foreign rulers in her own hand, correspondence with Egypt's Pharaoh Ramses II, the most powerful man on earth. Their words were not of war, but of peace and partnership. It was Pudu-Hepa who helped finalize the world's first recorded peace treaty, ensuring stability between two ancient superpowers. But her influence extended beyond diplomacy. As high priestess, she reorganized the sprawling Hittite pantheon, a bewildering collection of thousands of gods inherited from conquered lands. With method and faith, she sought to bring order to divinity itself, merging cults and ceremonies into a harmonious whole. In her writings, he often prayed for wisdom and fairness, invoking the gods not to destroy enemies, but to enlighten rulers. Her letters reveal a woman of remarkable intelligence and humility, one who addressed even the pharaoh as an equal, yet spoke with the grace of a believer. She was firm when needed, compassionate when possible, and endlessly practical. Her diplomacy was rooted not in manipulation, but in mutual respect and divine duty. Under her guidance, the royal court became a center of justice, faith, and reform. She advised her husband on domestic law, intervened in disputes, and managed vast temple estates. When she issued royal seals in her name, no one questioned her right, because by then the queen had become the conscience of the empire. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover her clay tablets, her voice still etched in cuneiform, speaking across time. They found not a queen lost in luxury, but a stateswoman with the heart of a philosopher. "May the sun goddess of Arina, my lady, and the storm god of heaven grant life and strength to my lord," she wrote. But her actions showed that strength was already hers. In Putuhepa's story, we glimpse a rare truth, that the ancient world was not solely a realm of kings and warriors. It was also shaped by the wisdom of women, by voices powerful enough to calm the storms of empires. And though her kingdom would one day fall into ruin, her legacy endures, written not only in clay, but in the enduring idea that true leadership lies in balance, compassion, and divine purpose. She was not merely the queen beside the king. She was the soul of the Hittite Empire, the storm god's chosen, and the memory time refused to silence. For generations, the lands between the Nile and the mountains of Anatolia had been soaked in blood. The Hittites and the Egyptians, two titans of the ancient world, clashed again and again for dominion over the crossroads of empires. Syria. Armies met beneath burning suns, their bronze chariots thundering through dust and chaos, their kings invoking gods who demanded victory at any cost. The conflict reached its crescendo at Kadesh, around 1274 BCE. Pharaoh Ramses II, the self-proclaimed son of Ra, led his forces northward to crush the Hittite presence once and for all. But waiting in the hills beyond the Orontes River was Muwatalli II, king of the Hittites, strategist, warrior, and master of deception. What followed was one of history's most legendary battles, fought not for plunder or vengeance, but for pride and legacy. Thousands of soldiers died on that parched field. The chariots of Egypt crashed against the iron will of the Hittites. When the dust settled, neither side could claim true victory. The borders remained uncertain, the gods unsatisfied. For years afterward, their conflict simmered, a cold war of spies, alliances, and suspicion. But time has a way of humbling even kings. Both empires, exhausted by decades of rivalry, faced new threats, rebellions, droughts, and restless neighbors. And in that exhaustion came something rare in the ancient world, the recognition that peace could serve power better than war. It was under Hattusili III, brother of Muwatalli, that the impossible began to unfold. Guided by his queen Putuhepa and the weight of his own faith, he sought a different kind of victory, the victory of diplomacy. Across the deserts, envoys rode from Hattusa to Pyramides, carrying clay tablets sealed with royal insignia. On them were words that would change history. In these tablets, the kings called each other brother, no longer enemies, but equals you, under the eyes of their gods. The Treaty of Kadesh, as it would later be known, pledged eternal peace between the two greatest powers of the Bronze Age. It promised mutual defense, extradition of fugitives, and the sacred oath that neither kingdom would invade the other again. The text was inscribed in two languages, Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform, so that both worlds might remember. But this was more than a political agreement. It was a spiritual act. The gods themselves were invoked as witnesses, the storm god of Hatti, the sun goddess of Arina, and the great Ra of Egypt. Breaking the treaty would not merely be treason, it would be a sin against heaven. To seal this peace, an extraordinary gesture followed. Ramses II married a Hittite princess, the daughter of Hattusili, uniting the two royal bloodlines. It was a symbolic act of trust that stunned the ancient world. For the first time, two civilizations that had once defined themselves by conflict now shared in kinship. The echoes of that peace would resound for centuries. The Hittites and Egyptians, once rivals for supremacy, became allies in trade and stability. And though both empires would one day crumble, their pact endured in memory, the first written peace treaty in human history. Today, a replica of that treaty stands in the United Nations headquarters in New York, a silent reminder from 3,000 years ago that even the most powerful kings once laid down their swords. It whispers a timeless truth, that peace is not weakness but wisdom, not surrender but survival. In an age of conquest, two rulers chose to defy their own gods of war, and in doing so, they left behind something rarer than empire itself. They left behind the peace of kings. In the heart of Anatolia, among stone citadels and thunderous skies, the Hittite Empire forged something more powerful than weapons or walls, a harmony of faiths. Their religion was not born from one god, one temple, or one sacred text. It was born from 1,000 gods, each carrying a fragment of truth, each reflecting the soul of the lands they ruled. To the Hittites, the divine world was vast, a mirror of the living one. Every mountain, river, and storm carried its own spirit. Every kingdom they conquered added new gods to their pantheon. Where other empires demanded submission, the Hittites sought integration. They believed that no single god could command all creation, that divinity was not singular, but infinite. They called their faith the religion of 1,000 gods. But this was no chaos of superstition. It was a symphony, a great orchestration of belief that blended the sacred traditions of Hatti, Hurrian, Luwian, and Mesopotamian peoples into one spiritual fabric. At its center stood the storm god of Hatti, lord of thunder and rain, protector of kings. His power was matched only by the sun goddess of Arina, radiant mother of life, justice, and renewal. Together they ruled the heavens, the divine couple whose union mirrored the balance of the empire itself. Every royal coronation, every treaty, every harvest festival began under their gaze. But the Hittites did not stop there. They absorbed the gods of the lands they conquered, Syrian deities like Teshob, Hurrian god of storms, and Hepat, queen of heaven. In their temples, these deities stood side by side, their stories interwoven, their rituals performed together. The Hittites built shrines within shrines, where statues of foreign gods stood beside local ones, their names carved in cuneiform, as if the divine spoke in every tongue. This spiritual inclusiveness was more than tolerance, it was a streak, strategy for unity. The empire stretched across diverse cultures and languages, from the Aegean coast to the Euphrates. To rule such a mosaic, the kings of Hatti understood that they must rule hearts as well as lands. By embracing the gods of others, they embraced their people, turning faith into the very foundation of empire. In the city of Yazilikaya, this divine tapestry was immortalized in stone. Carved into cliffs just outside Hattusa, hundreds of gods march in eternal procession. Warriors, kings, beasts, and spirits, all converging toward the meeting of the storm god and the sun goddess. It is one of the most haunting religious monuments of the ancient world, a pantheon carved from living rock, where mortal and immortal worlds meet in harmony. Even the royal family took part in these rituals. Kings and queens acted as intermediaries between humanity and the divine, offering prayers, libations, and sacrifices to maintain balance. Queen Puduhepa, herself a high priestess, sought to bring order to this vast pantheon, organizing, classifying, and honoring each deity by name and lineage. The Hittite religion, unlike many that came after it, did not seek to erase other faiths. It sought to understand them. To the Hittites, every god was a reflection of one greater truth, many faces of a single cosmic mystery. And perhaps that is why, even in their fall, the Hittites were never truly forgotten. Because in their worship of 1,000 gods, they revealed something profoundly human. That belief, like civilization itself, is strongest not when it conquers, but when it connects. 1,000 gods, 1,000 names, one vision, that the divine is everywhere, in every people, every culture, every breath of wind. This was the faith of the Hittites, a religion not of dominance but of unity, a bridge between worlds, carved in stone and spirit alike. There are moments in history when technology reshapes destiny. For the Hittites, that moment arrived not in the forge or the temple, but on the battlefield, Their weapon of choice was not a sword or spear, but the chariot, a machine of speed, precision, and terror. To their enemies, it was a storm on wheels. To the Hittites, it was the very symbol of divine power and royal might. Long before the age of iron, warfare was fought on foot, in tight ranks of bronze-clad men. But the Hittites saw the landscape differently. In the rolling plateaus and open plains of Anatolia, they envisioned a new kind of mobility, one that could turn battle into momentum. They perfected the chariot not as a burdened wagon, but as a sleek, deadly extension of the human body, half flesh, half thunder. The design was revolutionary. While Egyptian and Mycenaean chariots carried 2 warriors, a driver and an archer, the Hittite chariot bore 3 men. The extra soldier, often armed with javelins or a shield, gave them balance and flexibility in combat. To support this heavier crew, Hittite engineers repositioned the axle to the center of the chassis, distributing weight evenly and creating a more stable platform for warfare. The result was astonishing. On the fields of Kadesh, the world's largest recorded chariot battle, the Hittite army unleashed thousands of these machines, a rolling storm of wood, bronze, and horsepower. Contemporary accounts speak of the ground trembling, of horses screaming through dust and chaos, of Egyptian ranks shattering beneath the impact. The chariot, in Hittite hands, was not just a vehicle. It was an ideology of motion, a testament to discipline and design. Every detail mattered. The wheels were bound with rawhide for grip. The horses were bred and trained for endurance, not speed. The crews were soldiers and artisans, craftsmen of movement who learned to fight as one living mechanism. To command a Hittite chariot was an honor granted only to the elite, warriors who stood between the mortal and the divine. But beyond the battlefield, the chariot carried symbolic power. It became the throne of the gods, the seat of kings, the instrument through which divine will was made visible. In temple reliefs, the storm god of Hatti thunders across the sky in a chariot drawn by celestial bulls. In royal inscriptions, kings proclaim themselves as riders of the storm, chosen by heaven to rule both land and sky. The chariot was more than technology. It was theology in motion. It blurred the line between man and deity, between control and chaos. When the wheels turned, it was said, even the gods watched. Yet the Hittites' mastery of this machine came at a cost. As their empire expanded, so did their dependence on the chariot corps. Battles became larger, logistics more complex, and the delicate balance of supply and strategy grew fragile. In time, when drought and rebellion struck, the same roads that once carried the thunder of Hittite chariots would carry the silence of retreat. Still, their legacy endured. The Hittite chariot inspired generations of military design, from Persian scythed chariots to the disciplined cavalry of later empires. Its influence rippled through centuries, reshaping warfare and mobility across continents. In the quiet ruins of Hattusa, archaeologists have unearthed fragments of chariot fittings, bronze rein rings, and training tablets, echoes of the world's first mechanized army. Each artifact speaks of a people who understood that power was not just in strength, but in movement, in the ability to control speed, direction, and chaos itself. The Hittites ruled not from their walls, but from their wheels. They were the chariot empire, swift, unstoppable, and deadly. An ancient force of engineering and divinity, whose thunder once rolled across the Bronze Age world. Every empire falls not from the enemies at its gates, but from the whispers within its halls. For the Hittites, those whispers began long before their walls showed any cracks. Hattusa, the stone-hearted capital of the empire, was a city of power and paranoia. Within its palaces, kings ruled through divine right, yet every step they took echoed with uncertainty. Around them gathered nobles, generals, priests, and scribes, all sworn by sacred oath to serve their sovereign. But behind those oaths lay ambition, fear, and the quiet hunger for the throne itself. The Hittites were masters of law and diplomacy, but even their codified order could not restrain the turbulence of human desire. The royal court became a theater of loyalty and deception. Clay tablets unearthed from the archives speak of conspiracies that rippled through generations, of princes poisoned, of queens accused, of generals who rose in rebellion. The most haunting truth of all is that Hittite kings were often slain not by invading armies, but by their own kin. From the very dawn of the empire, succession was a curse. Brothers turned on brothers, sons plotted against fathers. The divine bloodline, believed to descend from the storm gods themselves, became both a blessing and a weapon. In the 16th century BCE, King Mursili I, who had marched his armies all the way to Babylon, was murdered upon his return, slain by a relative who coveted his crown. The empire he had forged in glory was plunged into civil strife. To restore order, later kings like Telepinu issued decrees meant to define clear inheritance and prevent bloodshed. But the ink of law could not wash away the stain of ambition. Power in Hattusa was too intoxicating to be contained. Outside the capital, rebellion simmered in the provinces. The Hittite Empire was a vast mosaic of conquered lands: Syria, Anatolia, and the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, each ruled by local vassals who bowed in public but schemed in secret. Treaties inscribed on clay bound them by divine oath to serve the king of Hatti, invoking curses upon any who betrayed him. Yet when famine struck, or when Egypt and Assyria offered gold, these vassals often broke their vows, switching sides like reeds in the wind. In the archives of Hattusa, letters survive, desperate messages from kings to their governors, pleading for loyalty, demanding tribute, warning of spies. "Do not trust the envoy," one tablet reads. "He carries lies from the east." Another bears the trembling seal of a ruler confessing that rebellion had already spread among his people. And so, within this empire of law, chaos found its own rhythm. The Hittite king became both ruler and prisoner, bound by ritual, burdened by fear. His throne was a seat of divine legitimacy, but also a place where daggers hid beneath the veil of ceremony. The queen, too, wielded immense power. Figures like Putuhepa stood as co-rulers, diplomats and high priestesses. Yet even they had to navigate a labyrinth of jealous nobles and rival factions. In a world where the favor of the gods determined destiny, a single rumor, a whispered accusation of impiety or blasphemy, could end a dynasty. But through all this turmoil, the Hittites endured. Their genius lay in resilience, the ability to rebuild after every betrayal, to forge unity out of chaos. They codified oaths, renewed treaties, and turned the memory of treachery into law. For every rebellion suppressed, for every conspirator executed, the message was clear. The gods of Hatti watched, and vengeance would come not only from men, but from heaven itself. And yet, as history would prove, even divine justice could not protect them forever. For when the time came, the enemies within, the ambition, the fractures, the silent hunger for power, would do what no foreign army ever could. They would open the gates of Hattusa from the inside. The Hittite Empire's greatest threat was never its rivals. It was the shadow that sat beside the throne, the hidden enemy that every ruler carried within his own heart. It began not with war, but with silence. The silence of rain that never came. The silence of fields turned to dust. The silence of gods who no longer answered their priests. Across the Hittite Empire, once green valleys browned under an unrelenting sun. Rivers shrank to trickles, and the lifeblood of Anatolia, grain, became more precious than gold. Farmers abandoned their lands, cities grew desperate, and caravans that once carried trade and tribute now carried only rumors of famine. Archaeologists would later uncover the truth buried beneath this silence. pollen records showing years of severe drought, texts describing grain shortages, and letters from desperate kings pleading for aid. One tablet, found in the ruins of Hattusa, reads simply, "There is no barley in the storehouses. The people grow thin." For the first time, the mighty Hittite machine, the empire that had once stood unshaken between Egypt and Babylon, began to creak under its own weight. The great roadways that connected the empire's provinces, once alive with traders and soldiers, became lines of desperation. Governors wrote to the capital begging for food. In some regions, the Hittite garrisons mutinied, taking what they could to survive. The king's messengers were attacked along the highways, their letters stolen, their seals broken. The bonds that held the empire together, law, loyalty, and divine authority, began to fray like old rope. Nature had become the empire's most relentless enemy, and nature, it seemed, had chosen its moment well. For at the same time, beyond the empire's borders, new forces were stirring. The Sea Peoples, fierce, wandering tribes displaced by the same drought that gripped Anatolia, began raiding the coasts. They struck ports and trade routes, cutting the empire off from vital supplies. To the east, Assyria rose again, hungering for lost lands. And in the south, Egypt's grip over Syria weakened, leaving a power vacuum that drew everyone into conflict. In the midst of this chaos stood the Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, the last to bear that ancient storm-forged title. His reign was marked not by conquest, but by crisis. Clay tablets record his attempts to send ships to the coast to secure grain, his negotiations with foreign rulers, his prayers to the gods. Yet even a king could not command the weather. The temples filled with smoke and desperation. Priests offered endless sacrifices, hoping to rekindle divine favor. The people begged for signs, for omens, for mercy. But the skies remained empty, and the earth stayed hard. In the myths of the time, the storm god Tahun, once the bringer of rain and fertility, was said to have turned away from Hatti. Some believed that the sins of the court, the blood of betrayals, had angered him beyond forgiveness. The empire's strength, once drawn from unity, now dissolved into fragments. Vassal kings refused tribute. Local rulers fortified their towns. Even the capital's walls, once a symbol of endurance, began to crumble from neglect. Archaeologists walking the ruins of Hattusa today can still trace the signs: unfinished repairs, abandoned homes, grain silos left empty. The city that had once commanded the Bronze Age world was shrinking, not from conquest, but from within. And yet amidst this slow collapse, there was no single day of doom. No enemy storming the gates, no sudden fire or battle. Just the slow, patient erosion of a civilization that had once believed itself eternal. The Hittite Empire, that chariot-driving, law-forging, God-bound realm, had entered its twilight. The cracks that began with drought and famine were more than physical. They were spiritual. They were moral. They were the quiet realization that even empires built by gods are, in the end, made of earth and... As the storms finally returned, long after the last king of Hatti had vanished from the chronicles, they fell not on the living, but on ruins. It came with no warning, unseen, unspoken, and unstoppable. Not an army marching through the valleys of Anatolia, but something far more silent, far more cruel. The plague. To the Hittites, it was not merely disease. It was divine punishment, a curse from gods angered by human failings, a shadow sent to remind mortals of their place in the cosmic order. But whatever its origin, it struck without mercy. From the great palaces of Hattusa to the smallest village huts, death moved through the empire like smoke. Clay tablets from the royal archives tell the story in fragments. desperate prayers, royal decrees, and ritual pleas. The plague does not leave the land, one letter laments. Day after day, people fall. The gods have turned their faces away. Historians believe the epidemic first came from Egypt, a bitter echo of war and diplomacy intertwined. After the legendary Battle of Kadesh, the Hittite king Suppiluliuma had captured many Egyptian prisoners, bringing them north as servants and laborers. But among them came something unseen, an illness that would outlive kings and destroy dynasties. Within months, it had reached the capital. Suppiluliuma himself fell ill, as did his son. 2 kings lost within a single generation. The royal line, once believed to be chosen by the gods, now lay shattered by something no sword could strike down. The empire trembled, not just from death, but from disbelief. The priests offered sacrifices day and night, calling on every god in their vast pantheon, the storm god Tahun, the sun goddess of Arinna, the 1,000 deities of every conquered land. But the heavens remained silent. Temples overflowed with offerings, yet the sick continued to die in the streets. In the minds of the Hittites, the plague was not random. It was moral. It was judgment. Somewhere, they believed, a sin had been committed so great that even the gods chid. Osen nation could no longer be spared. Rituals grew darker, more desperate. Entire cities turned to purification ceremonies, burning incense through the night. Priests walked the streets chanting prayers of atonement, their voices echoing between the stone walls like wind through tombs. But still, the plague spread. Farmers fled their lands, soldiers deserted their posts, and merchants abandoned their caravans. Trade routes collapsed. The once bustling roads of the empire grew quiet, marked only by the creak of funerary wagons and the cries of mourners. It wasn't only bodies that died, it was faith. For centuries, the Hittites had believed their kings ruled by divine mandate, bound in sacred partnership with the gods. But when those same gods refused to answer, and their chosen king fell to the same sickness as his servants, the illusion of divine protection began to crumble. The empire's heart, once held together by religion, began to fracture under the weight of doubt. The priesthood grew divided. Some argued that new gods must be appeased. Others insisted the old rituals had been corrupted. The unity of belief that had given Hattie its strength turned into a storm of confusion and fear. Archaeologists have found burial pits from this era, hastily dug, filled with dozens of bodies. No inscriptions, no offerings, no names, just the quiet evidence of a people overwhelmed. In time, the plague would fade, as all plagues do. But the damage it left behind was not merely physical. It had broken something sacred, the bond between heaven and earth, between kings and their gods, between the empire and its own sense of destiny. And though the Hittites rebuilt, though new kings rose and armies marched again, something in their spirit never recovered. The old confidence was gone, replaced by an unease that no prayer could dispel. The plague had done what no foreign power ever could. It made the Hittites question the gods who made them strong. It made them mortal again. It began with whispers in the wind, villages vanishing overnight, smoke rising on distant horizons, and rumors of strangers crossing the seas. The world was shifting. Around the 12th century BCE, a storm of humanity began to move, unstoppable, unpredictable, and unexplained. Entire nations, once rooted for generations, abandoned their lands. They came from the north, from across the mountains and over the waters, families, warriors, farmers, all driven by hunger, drought, or the collapse of the only world they had ever known. The Hittites called them the peoples without land. The Egyptians later named them the Sea Peoples. But no one truly knew where they came from. Some said they were exiles from broken kingdoms. Others believed they were wanderers seeking new homes in a dying age. Whatever their origins, their arrival would tear the Bronze Age apart. For centuries, trade had bound the empires together. Egypt, Mycenae, Babylon, Ugarit, and Hatti. Bronze flowed like lifeblood across this web, linking copper from Cyprus to tin from Anatolia. Ships crossed the Mediterranean, carrying goods, ideas, and power. But when the balance broke, when drought starved the land and kingdoms began to crumble, those same routes became pathways of invasion. The Hittite heartland was one of the first to feel the tremors. Northern frontiers fell silent. Outposts ceased sending messages. Then, reports arrived. Bands of migrants moving south, overwhelming garrisons, burning what they could not claim. These were not organized armies. They were desperate multitudes, carrying their homes on their backs, their gods in their memories. To the kings of Hatti, it was chaos beyond comprehension. For generations, they had ruled through law, diplomacy, and divine order. Now they faced something primal, a human tide that could not be negotiated with, that sought not conquest, but survival. Clay tablets from this time reveal a world unraveling. "The enemy comes," one scribe wrote. But who are they? They come from the sea, from the north, from the earth itself. In the royal archives of Ugarit, a city soon to fall, a desperate letter was sent. "My father, the enemy ships are here. The cities burn. Where are your armies? Send help, quickly!" No help ever came. Across the Mediterranean, ancient harbors turned to graveyards of ships. Fields lay untended, roads abandoned, temples desecrated. Kingdom after kingdom fell, not to a single conqueror, but to a wave of movement that reshaped the known world. And yet, these migrations were not merely destruction, they were transformation. Out of the ashes of the Bronze Age would rise new civilizations, the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Israelites, cultures that would inherit the fragments of those that came before. The storm of collapse became the seedbed of renewal. But for the Hittites, there would be no such rebirth. Their empire, already weakened by famine, plague, and internal strife, could not withstand the endless tide. Provinces fell one by one. Communication with the capital ceased. The once great cities of Anatolia were left in ruins, their stone gates standing like gravestones over a forgotten age. In time, even the memory of the Hittites faded. Their language, once spoken by kings and carved into clay, disappeared into the earth. Their gods, once invoked by priests and queens, were silenced by centuries of wind and dust. The migrations had done more than destroy kingdoms. They had erased the map itself. And yet, in that great movement of peoples, in the wanderers who crossed seas and deserts in search of survival, lay a reflection of something eternal: humanity's resilience. For every civilization that falls, there are always those who carry its echoes forward. They may not remember the names of their gods or kings, but they carry the fire and the will to begin again. The empire that once ruled half the known world was beginning to fracture, not from the assault of foreign armies, but from something far more dangerous: betrayal within. In the grand halls of Hattusa, messages arrived on clay tablets, each bearing the same grim pattern: uprisings in the provinces, silence from the governors, cities once loyal now swearing allegiance to no one. The Hittite Empire, once bound by faith, law, and royal decree, was splintering into chaos. It began quietly: whispers in the temples, doubts in the markets, hesitation among the soldiers. The gods seemed distant, the kings uncertain. Years of drought had emptied granaries. Trade routes were collapsing under the weight of migration and war. Once proud vassal states, who had long paid tribute to the great king of Hatti, now saw weakness in the heart of the empire, and they began to act. In the western lands of Arzawa and the coastal cities near the Aegean, rebellion flared like wildfire. Governors who once sent gifts to Hattusa now raised their own banners. In the south, the great city of Kadesh, once the prize of the empire, turned its loyalty to Egypt. The Hittites' allies were becoming their enemies, one by one. For generations, the Hittites had ruled through a delicate balance of diplomacy and divine authority. Treaties sealed with oaths to the storm god kept their vassals in check. But when famine struck, when the royal storehouses could no longer feed the provinces, those oaths began to mean little. One letter found centuries later in the ruins of a border fortress reads simply, "The king commands, but the fields give nothing. The gods are silent. We cannot obey." It was not rebellion born of ambition. It was survival. And yet, as each province broke away, the empire's heart grew colder. The royal court became a place of suspicion. Advisors accused each other of treachery. Generals plotted their own ascents to the throne. Even among the priesthood, faith wavered. The once mighty unity that had held the Hittites together was now corroded by mistrust. Armies were dispatched to crush the revolts, but the soldiers were weary. Fighting on empty stomachs, their loyalties stretched thin. Some refused to march. Others deserted mid-battle. Whole garrisons joined the rebels they were sent to destroy. And all the while the great city of Hattusa stood silent, its walls towering above the Anatolian plateau, like a ghost watching its own demise. From those heights, the king could see the fires burning on the horizon, his empire disintegrating piece by piece. It is one of the cruel ironies of history. Empires rarely fall because of the strength of their enemies. They fall because of the weakness within. For centuries, the Hittites had built their world on trust in their laws, their gods, their kings. When that trust eroded, the foundation cracked. Clay tablets record the anguish of those final years. One scribe wrote, "The king prays to the gods, but no answer comes. The people curse his name, and the armies no longer march. The world is breaking apart." Rebellion within had achieved what no foreign invader could, the slow, silent unmaking of an empire. And so, as the chariots rusted and the temples emptied, the once great Hittite kingdom dissolved into dust. Its cities would lie abandoned for centuries, its name forgotten, its language lost to time. But history remembers the echoes, the quiet warning left by every fallen power. No empire is ever conquered until it first betrays itself. High up on the Anatolian plateau, surrounded by walls of stone and silence, the city of Hattusa once gleamed like a crown. It was the heart of an empire, the seat of kings who ruled through thunder and decree, a place where every road, every letter, every prayer led. But as the final century of the Bronze Age drew near, the fires that would consume this mighty capital were already kindling within its heart. The signs came quietly at first, not with swords but with silence. Couriers stopped arriving from the outer provinces. Farmers abandoned their fields. The once bustling markets fell still. The royal scribes, who once filled tablets with decrees and treaties, began recording pleas for help. "The storehouses are empty," one wrote. "The gods do not answer." The empire's veins, its trade routes, its alliances, its lifelines, had gone cold. Inside the palace the air grew heavy. The great king still performed his rituals to the storm god, but even the priests whispered doubts behind closed doors. The temples that had once echoed with hymns were now filled with desperate prayers. Then came the drought, year after year without rain. The rivers thinned, the fields turned to dust. Hattusa, built on power and plenty, found itself gasping. The people watched their world contract, not under siege from enemies, but under siege from time and hunger. When famine spread through the lower city, rebellion followed. Soldiers once sworn to the king began looting the granaries they were meant to guard. The royal guards turned their spears inward, protecting what little remained. Smoke rose above the rooftops, not from invaders, but from the hands of Hittites themselves. It was then that the final storm gathered. Whether it was the vengeance of the gods or the culmination of human despair, no one could say. What we know is this. One night, the fires came. The flames began in the lee.
Oh, a city, perhaps in a warehouse, perhaps in a revolt, but they spread swiftly, devouring wood and temple alike. The wind howled through the city gates, carrying sparks that leapt across the stone walls. Clay tablets hardened in the heat, freezing forever, the last words of an empire in collapse. Archaeologists, centuries later, would uncover their remains, rows upon rows of blackened tablets, sealed by the very fire that destroyed the city. Among them were records of desperate times, crop failures, missing shipments, broken treaties. One final message, half-burned but legible, read, "The king waits for aid that will not come. The city burns. May the gods remember us." And then, silence. When the smoke cleared, Hattusa was no more. The grand gates, the Lion Gate, the King's Gate, stood open, not in triumph, but in surrender to time. The once great citadel, with its sprawling palaces and archives, was left to the wind and ash. No conquering army claimed it. No enemy banner was raised. The capital of the Hittites fell not because it was defeated, but because it had already died from within. For centuries afterward, travelers passed the ruins and wondered who could have built such walls, such stones. None remembered the name of Hattusa, or the gods that once thundered over its skies. Only the silence endured, and the faint echo of fire over stone. The empire that had ruled through order, law, and divine will had ended not with a battle cry, but with a whisper, a quiet surrender to forces far greater than kings. And so the last flame of the Hittite world flickered out beneath a crimson sky, leaving behind only ruins, and the memory of what once was. There was once an age when the world was connected, a golden web of kingdoms bound by trade, diplomacy, and shared ambition. Ships crossed the Mediterranean, bearing copper, tin, and gold. Messengers rode between palaces in Egypt, Mycenae, Babylon, and Hattusa, carrying treaties sealed with divine oaths. Bronze, the very metal that defined the era, flowed through their hands, linking them in a fragile balance of prosperity and power. And then suddenly, it was gone. Around 1200 BCE, the lights of civilization dimmed across the known world. Great cities burned, empires vanished, and writing itself fell silent. For more than 3,000 years, historians would wonder, what happened? The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not one of a single catastrophe, but of many striking all at once. It began with the sky. For years the rains failed, drought spread across the Near East, drying rivers, emptying fields, and driving entire populations to desperation. In the lands of Anatolia and Syria, famine gnawed at the people. The once fertile valleys that fed empires turned to dust. Without food, trade faltered. Without trade, armies could not march. And then came the wars. Desperate migrations, waves of displaced peoples, swept across the Mediterranean like a storm. They came from the north and the sea, burning cities as they moved. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, their ships darkening the horizon. The Hittites faced them from the west, the Mycenaeans from the islands. Everywhere they landed, kingdoms fell. In Ugarit, letters were sent pleading for aid. "The enemy ships are here. Our city burns. Send help, my lord." But no help came. The messenger likely never reached his destination. The city was destroyed before the tablet had even cooled. Trade routes collapsed. With them fell the delicate systems that had sustained centuries of cooperation. Without tinners, bronze could no longer be forged. Without bronze, weapons and tools lost their strength. Armies turned to iron, crude and unrefined, the metal of a new, harsher age. The collapse was total. The mighty Mycenaean palaces of Greece, gone. The cities of Canaan and Syria, burned. The empire of Hatti, silent, its capital reduced to ash. Even Egypt, the eternal kingdom of the Nile, barely survived, scarred and weakened beyond recognition. For centuries, humanity forgot how to write, how to build, how to dream. It was a dark silence that spanned generations, a world stripped of memory. But within this destruction, something else was being born. The old world had fallen, yet from its ashes, the seeds of a new age began to stir. The Iron Age dawned, reshaping civilization. Small city-states rose where empires had crumbled. The Greeks would one day tell tales of the heroes of Troy, echoes of this same fallen age. The Hebrews would record stories of Exodus and divine wrath. The Phoenicians would sail again, carrying knowledge forward into the new world. The Bronze Age had ended, not in a single night, but through decades of unraveling. Drought, war, migration, rebellion, and the silent failure of systems too complex to survive their own success. The fall of that age reminds us that even the greatest networks, when built on fragile threads of dependence, can collapse in an instant. And yet, history never truly ends. It bends, it breaks, it reshapes. Out of the ashes of the old world, humanity endured. We remembered, rebuilt, and rose once more, carrying with us the faint memory of an age when gods walked among kings, and bronze sang the song of empire. In the late centuries of the second millennium BCE, the world trembled. Across continents, kingdoms that had stood for 1,000 years began to crumble, not in a single battle, but in a slow, unstoppable wave of destruction. It was as if the earth itself had turned against the giants that once ruled it. From the Nile to the Aegean, the lights of civilization flickered and died. In Egypt, the empire of the pharaohs, once the unshakable heart of the ancient world, faced invasion from the sea. Ramesses III, the last of Egypt's warrior kings, recorded the terror in carved stone, fleets of unknown warriors striking from the waves, cities burning, fields barren. These were the sea peoples, mysterious wanderers, whose arrival marked the twilight of empires. Egypt fought them off, barely. But victory came at a terrible cost. The treasury was empty, the people starved, and the power of the pharaohs was broken forever. To the north, Ugarit, the jewel of the Syrian coast, met its end in fire. It was a city of trade, language, and light, a place where merchants spoke in dozens of tongues, where ships carried goods from every corner of the Mediterranean. But one day, the messages stopped. Archaeologists later found the last words of Ugarit etched on a clay tablet, a plea for help sent to a distant ally. "The enemy is near. The ships are burning our towns. Come quickly. There is no escape for us." The letter was never sent. The kiln's heat had not even cooled before Ugarit was gone. Further west, the Mycenaean palaces of Greece fell into ruin. Once, their kings ruled from fortresses like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, the world of Agamemnon, of Homer's legends. But as trade collapsed and invasions spread, these proud citadels burned. Their storerooms were emptied, their writing, linear B, vanished. The warriors of Greece became wanderers, their descendants telling stories of gods and heroes to remember what they had lost. One by one, the pillars of the ancient world cracked. The Hittite Empire, gone. Ugarit, ashes. Mycenae, silent. Even Babylon, the city of Hammurabi and legend, staggered and fell to new powers rising from the east. No one could stop it. This was not the fall of one kingdom. It was the unraveling of a world system. The networks of trade, the bonds of diplomacy, the balance of empires, all collapsed together. And with them went literacy, administration, and the memory of centuries. For hundreds of years, humanity entered a silence so deep that even the gods seemed to withdraw. But why did the giants fall? Historians still debate. Was it drought and famine? Was it war and invasion? Was it rebellion, technology, or the failure of leadership? Perhaps it was all of them. A perfect storm that no civilization, no matter how mighty, could withstand. And yet, amidst the ruins, seeds of rebirth remained. Egypt survived, humbled but alive. In the shadows of Mycenae, small Greek villages endured, carrying within them the sparks of a coming age. Babylon would rise again under new rulers, its ziggurats reaching once more toward the heavens. The fall of the Bronze Age giants was not the end. It was a transformation. The old gods, kings, and empires had fallen silent, but humanity had not. From their ashes, the world would awaken into something new. An age of iron, of writing reborn, of new powers and new myths. The earth had buried its past, but time would dig it up again, piece by piece, tablet by tablet, stone by stone. And only then would we realize the fall of giants was not just history's tragedy. It was its beginning. There are empires whose ruins define history. Egypt with its pyramids, Babylon with its ziggurats, Rome with its marble bones. And then there are those that vanish, not slowly, but utterly, as though time itself decided to erase their name. The Hittite Empire was one of them. At their height, they ruled the heart of Anatolia, forged the world's first peace treaty, and stood toe-to-toe with pharaohs. They had laws, cities, armies, and gods of thunder and fire. Yet within a single generation, they disappeared, leaving no trace, no legend, not even a whisper in the chronicles of their enemies. For over 3,000 years, the world forgot the Hittites ever existed. When later historians looked back on the Bronze Age, they found only silence. Egyptian records spoke vaguely of a people called the Kheta, but no one knew who they were. The Bible mentioned Hittites in passing, but to scholars, these seemed to be small Canaanite tribes, not a mighty empire. The great cities of the Hittites, Hattusa, Carchemish, Alalach, lay buried beneath centuries of soil and stone, hidden from human memory. It was as if an entire civilization had been swallowed whole by the earth. Then, in the late 19th century, whispers began to return. In the rugged hills of central Turkey, explorers stumbled upon strange ruins, massive stone walls, sculpted gates guarded by lions and sphinxes. Carved on the stones were hieroglyphs no one could read, written in a language that resembled nothing known from Egypt, Mesopotamia, or Greece. Locals called it Boğazköy, a desolate site lost among the mountains. But when archaeologists began to dig, they uncovered something extraordinary. Archives. Thousands of clay tablets, baked by fire and time, covered in a script resembling Babylonian cuneiform, but in a language no scholar recognized. It took decades before their meaning was unlocked. When they finally deciphered, the world stood stunned. These tablets were royal decrees, diplomatic letters, religious hymns, the voice of an empire that had been lost to time. They spoke of Hattusa, capital of the Hittites, of kings named Suppiluliuma and Mursili, of wars with Egypt, of gods with 1,000 faces. The forgotten people of the mountains were not a myth. They were one of the great superpowers of the ancient world. The rediscovery of the Hittites changed everything. It rewrote maps, reshaped timelines, and forced historians to confront the fragility of civilization itself. For if an empire so vast, commanding armies, laws, and diplomacy, could vanish without a trace, how many more might still lie hidden beneath the soil, waiting to be found? And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all, that history is not a straight line, but a series of disappearances. The Hittites were not destroyed by a single enemy. They were undone by time, by silence, by the collapse of the world around them. Their fall was not marked by conquest, but by forgetting. Yet through the work of archaeologists and linguists, their voices speak again. The prayers of their kings, the treaties they signed, the fears they confessed to their gods, all rise from the dust like echoes returning from eternity. The empire that vanished has been found again, but its story is a warning carved in clay, that no matter how mighty a civilization becomes, time will one day ask, will you be remembered, or will you vanish too? It began, as so many great discoveries do, with curiosity and a rumor whispered among the hills of central Turkey. In the late 1800s, European travelers wandered through the rugged Anatolian plateau, searching for traces of forgotten empires. The locals spoke of strange stones near a village called Boğazköy, massive blocks half buried in the earth, carved with symbols no one could read. To most, they were merely relics of some bygone age. But to one man, they were a mystery calling out to be solved. That man was Charles Texier, a French archaeologist and explorer. In 1834, following ancient maps and local tales, he set out on horseback into the windswept plains of modern-day Turkey. The journey was brutal, across jagged ridges, dense forests, and desolate valleys, where time itself seemed to stand still. But when Texier finally arrived at Boğazköy, he beheld something extraordinary. Before him rose the ruins of a vast city, sprawled across the hills. Colossal stone gates guarded by lions, fragments of temples and fortifications, and great walls that once encircled a metropolis. This was no mere village of shepherds or tribesmen. This was the heartbeat of a forgotten empire. Texier carefully mapped the site, sketching its towers and citadels, its mysterious hieroglyphs and colossal architecture, but he could not name it. There were no Greek inscriptions, no Roman markers, no connection to any known civilization. It was as if the city had emerged from a civilization lost entirely to memory. For decades, Boğazköy remained an enigma. Explorers came and went, each uncovering fragments of its grandeur, but the identity of its builders remained locked behind the silence of time. Then, in 1906, a team of German archaeologists, led by Hugo Winkler, returned to Boğazköy with a new mission, to uncover its secrets, layer by layer. What they found would rewrite the history of the ancient world. Buried beneath the ruins lay thousands of clay tablets, sealed within the remains of what was once a royal archive. When Winkler's team lifted them from the dust, they realized these were not mere fragments. They were entire libraries, preserved by fire and time. The tablets bore cuneiform script, the same wedge-shaped writing used in Mesopotamia, but in a language no one had ever seen before. For years, scholars puzzled over these inscriptions. Were they Assyrian, Babylonian, some unknown dialect? The mystery deepened until 1915, when a Czech linguist named Bedřich Hrozný made a breakthrough that stunned the academic world. He deciphered the language. Hrozný realized that these tablets were written in an Indo-European tongue, related to the very roots of languages like Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. And within the texts, he found names of kings, treaties, and rituals that matched faint echoes from Egyptian records, the same mysterious people once called the Khita. The lost empire had a name again, the Hittites. With that revelation, everything changed. What had seemed like a provincial ruin became the capital of one of the greatest powers of the ancient world. Hattusa, the heart of the Hittite Empire. Scholars now understood that this city once rivaled Thebes and Babylon, that its kings signed peace with pharaohs, that its priests worshipped 1,000 gods beneath the open sky. The forgotten stones of Boazköy were no longer silent. They were singing the story of a civilization that time had erased. Today, the ruins of Hattusa still rise from the Anatolian earth, gates carved with lions, tunnels that once led to the heart of temples, and the scattered remains of tablets that once governed half the known world. And as the wind moves through its empty streets, one can almost hear the whisper of history returning. The voice of an empire reborn, Rom dust, reminding us that even when time forgets, the earth remembers. When the first clay tablets were unearthed from the ashes of Hattusa, the air itself seemed to tremble with revelation. For more than 3,000 years, they had slept, sealed within the archives of kings, untouched by light or breath. Each tablet was a voice trapped in time, a message pressed into clay by hands that once ruled an empire and then vanished without a trace. Archaeologists brushed the dust from their surfaces, revealing lines of delicate wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform script, the writing of the ancient world. But these symbols told a story unlike any found in Mesopotamia or Babylon. These were the words of a people whose existence had been erased from memory, the Hittites. At first, the tablets were only fragments of mystery, lists of offerings, decrees of kings, fragments of myths. But as more were uncovered, thousands upon thousands, the scale of discovery grew astonishing. They were not merely documents. They were an entire civilization's heartbeat, preserved in fired earth. Within those archives, archaeologists found records of diplomacy and war, trade and tribute, prayers and treaties, an empire speaking across time. One tablet described a treaty with Egypt, signed in the name of Hattusili III and Ramses II, the earliest known peace agreement in human history. Another listed the laws of the land, precise, humane, and astonishingly advanced for its age. Still others contained the prayers of queens, the dreams of kings, and the rituals of priests invoking the gods of storm and sky. For centuries, historians had believed the Bible and Egyptian inscriptions told the full story of the ancient Near East. But these tablets changed everything. They revealed a power equal to Babylon, a kingdom that once stood at the crossroads of empires, and then disappeared so completely that even its name had been forgotten. Each translation brought the Hittites back to life. Through these tablets we heard their kings speak of loyalty and justice, of betrayal and divine favor. We saw their queens, especially Puduhepa, whose letters to the pharaoh of Egypt read with the tone of a stateswoman, commanding respect and peace across kingdoms. The tablets even preserved myths and prayers, stories of gods who rose and fell, storms that spoke, and rituals that bound heaven and earth together. They revealed a world of profound spirituality, where divine power was not distant, but woven into every moment of existence. But perhaps the most astonishing revelation was not their content, it was their language. The script was cuneiform, but the tongue beneath it was alien to scholars. For years, linguists debated its origin, until Czech scholar Bedřich Hrozný noticed something miraculous: familiar patterns within the foreign text. He read aloud from one line, "Nu ninda an ezateni, watama ekuteni." You will eat bread and drink water. It was the moment when silence broke. The tablets spoke, and their meaning became clear. The Hittites were the earliest known Indo-European civilization, the ancestors, linguistically, of much of Europe and South Asia. Their words were not dead relics. They were the beginnings of countless tongues still spoken today. And as archaeologists pieced together the archives, the forgotten empire of Anatolia rose again. Not in stone, but in sound. The clay tablets of Hattusa had survived fire, time, and oblivion. They had endured when walls crumbled and gods were forgotten, And now, after 3 millennia of silence, they whispered once more. Through them, the Hittites found immortality, not through monuments, but through language. The voice of an empire long buried beneath the earth had returned, carried not by kings or armies, but by the fragile breath of words pressed into clay. Pistore clay tablets key, poke again, and history listened. In the quiet halls of a European museum, under the dim light of oil lamps and the hum of early 20th century discovery, a linguist bent over a tablet that had not been read for over 3,000 years. His name was Bedřich Hrozný, a Czech scholar whose patience was legendary, and whose curiosity burned brighter than any lantern that illuminated his desk. Before him lay fragments of clay, words carved by a people who no longer existed, written in a script borrowed from Mesopotamia, but carrying an unknown tongue. Scholars before him had studied these inscriptions and shrugged in defeat. The language of the Hittites, they said, was lost forever. But Hrozný was not satisfied with silence. He saw in these wedge-shaped marks not confusion, but pattern. He noticed endings that echoed those of ancient Greek and Sanskrit, verbs that moved like the breath of familiar tongues. To others, the tablets were mystery. To him, they were music, faint echoes of something he instinctively knew. And then came the line that changed history. Nu ninda an ezateni watama ekuteni. 4 simple words. To most scholars they were nonsense, a jumble of syllables. But Hrozný paused. Ninda, bread. Watar, water. He began to translate. You will eat bread and drink water. It was the moment when the impossible became clear. The Hittites were speaking not an alien tongue, but one related to the languages of Europe and India. Hrozny's heart must have pounded as realization set in. These tablets were not the work of an isolated culture. They were the earliest voice of an entire Indo-European world, thousands of years older than anyone had imagined. When he presented his findings in 1915, the academic world was stunned. The Hittites, long dismissed as mythic or minor, were suddenly recognized as the first known Indo-European civilization in recorded history. The discovery rewove the linsys, gistic map of humanity. Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Persian, all these languages, it turned out, had an ancient relative buried beneath the soil of Anatolia. But for Hrozný, this was not just a scholarly triumph. It was a resurrection. The clay tablets that had lain mute for millennia now spoke with clarity and emotion. Through their words, kings issued decrees, priests recited prayers, and diplomats negotiated with Egypt and Babylon. Hrozný had given a lost empire its voice. Imagine his quiet awe, sitting alone amid shelves of tablets, hearing in his mind the sound of words no living soul had spoken in 3,000 years. Each symbol he deciphered restored a piece of the Hittite world, its cities, its rituals, its struggles, its humanity. The clay tablets were no longer artifacts, they were echoes of people. Through Hrozny's insight, the Hittites emerged not as shadows in the margins of history, but as architects of civilization, a people whose laws, technology, and language shaped the dawn of the modern world. His discovery reshaped archaeology, linguistics, and our understanding of who we are. It proved that human connection, through language, can survive even the fall of empires. The same words that once fed the people of Hattusa had found their descendants in the languages of countless nations. As Bedřich Hrozný laid down his pen, he knew he had done more than decipher a language. He had rebuilt a bridge across time, from the Bronze Age to the present, from silence to sound. The Hittites spoke again. And because of one man's relentless curiosity, the lost empire of Anatolia would never be forgotten. For more than 3,000 years, the Hittite Empire had been a ghost. Its name had faded from the chronicles of kings, its monuments buried under Anatolia's restless earth. Yet piece by piece, century by century, the lost world of the Hittites began to rise again, not by chance, but through the combined power of archaeology, language, and legend. It began with whispers, a few mysterious references in Egyptian inscriptions and the Old Testament to a people called the Hittim or Kati. No one knew who they were or where they had gone. Some scholars dismissed them as myth. Others suspected a forgotten civilization lay beneath the high plains of modern-day Turkey. In the 19th century, explorers and archaeologists began to search those lands, a vast landscape of hills, valleys, and ancient stones. When Charles Texier reached the ruins near Boğazköy in 1834, he stumbled upon something astonishing: colossal gates, lion statues, and inscriptions in an unfamiliar script carved deep into rock and clay. He didn't yet know it, but he had rediscovered Hattusa, the capital of a forgotten superpower. Decades later, archaeologists Hugo Winkler and Theodore Macready unearthed the city's archives. Thousands of clay tablets sealed in the dust of time. Within those tablets lay the soul of an empire, royal decrees, treaties, myths, and prayers. The Hittites, once erased, were now speaking again, and every word they uttered rewrote history. But it wasn't just archaeology that resurrected them. It was linguistics, the painstaking work of decoding a lost language. When Bedřich Hrozný cracked the code of the Hittite tongue in 1915, he opened a gateway into their minds. Suddenly, the cuneiform tablets were no longer mute relics. They were alive with stories, laws, and dreams. And then there were the myths, fragments that scholars found scattered across the ancient Near East. They spoke of a storm god battling chaos, of sacred mountains, of divine feasts that renewed the world. As linguists compared these tales with Greek and Mesopotamian myths, they saw echoes: Zeus, Marduk, Thor, all resonating with the Hittite storm god, Tahuna. Through these parallels, the mythic imagination of the ancient world began to knit itself together again. In laboratories and museums, fragments of clay were fitted back together like the bones of a long-extinct creature. Each piece revealed a detail: a festival, a military campaign, a treaty, a prayer whispered to unseen gods. Slowly the image emerged: an empire of warriors and priests, kings and queens, bound by faith in the balance between heaven and earth. Hattusa's ruins revealed more than politics. They revealed philosophy. The Hittites understood impermanence. Their inscriptions speak of loyalty, humility, and the will of the gods, reflecting a worldview that still feels startlingly human. They recorded not only their victories but their failures, acknowledging that even the mightiest empires can crumble when they forget their connection to nature and the divine. What archaeology unearthed, linguistics interpreted, and mythology reimagined, together they reconstructed not just a kingdom, but a civilization's soul. From broken tablets and scattered myths, scholars rebuilt an empire that had shaped the ancient world, yet vanished so thoroughly it had once seemed like legend. And so, the Hittites returned, not as conquerors, but as voices, whispering through time. Their rediscovery became one of humanity's greatest acts of remembrance, proving that even when history forgets, the earth remembers. Today, when we stand among the stones of Hattusa, we do not see ruins. We see a dialogue between past and present. We hear the echo of languages that once filled the air with prayer and command. Through the eyes of archaeologists, linguists, and storytellers, a civilization long lost to oblivion has been reborn. The Hittites live again, not in power, but in memory. And in that, they are eternal. Every empire believes it will endure forever. Every king believes his name will be remembered. But the stones of Hattusa tell another story, one written not in triumph, but in warning. The Hittites, once masters of the ancient world, learned a truth that transcends time. No civilization falls overnight. It unravels from within. For centuries, the Hittite Empire thrived. Its borders stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the valleys of Syria. Its kings ruled with divine authority, its chariots thundered across the plains, and its gods were worshipped in temples of gold and stone. But beneath that grandeur, the first cracks had already begun to spread. The land, once fertile and generous, began to withhold its gifts. Drought gripped the highlands, crops withered in the fields, rivers that once carried life through the heart of the empire ran dry. Nature itself, that delicate balance between heaven and earth the Hittites had always honored, seemed to turn away. But it wasn't only the earth that rebelled. Inside the royal court, ambition became poison. Vassal kings who once swore allegiance began to plot independence. Generals whispered in shadows. Even the priesthood, the spiritual core of the empire, was divided. What had once been a network of unity, political, divine, and natural, began to fracture. It is a pattern as old as civilization itself. The more powerful a nation becomes, the further it drifts from the forces that sustain it. The Hittites forgot that their strength did not come from conquest alone, but from harmony, with land, with people, and with spirit. When famine struck, when plague swept through the cities, when the gods no longer seemed to answer their prayers, fear replaced faith. Kings turned to war to restore stability, draining their strength even further. Each victory on the battlefield became hollow, each treaty a temporary bandage or a growing wound. And then came the final blow, the one no empire can escape, time itself. The world around the Hittites was changing. The Bronze Age, the great age of kings and chariots, was ending. Trade routes collapsed, migrations surged, and the once stable web of ancient civilizations dissolved into chaos. The Hittites, weakened by years of internal decay, could not withstand the storm. Hattusa burned, not by conquest, but by abandonment. The quiet surrender of a people who had lost the will to endure. Yet within that fall lies a lesson far greater than loss. The Hittites remind us that civilizations are not only measured by power, but by connection. The invisible threads that bind humans to one another and to the earth that sustains them. When those threads are severed, no wall, no army, no god can save an empire from itself. Their story echoes through history, in Rome's arrogance, in the collapse of the Maya, in the industrial empires of our own age. Nature's balance, social unity, and moral purpose. These are not luxuries, they are the foundations of survival. The Hittites forgot that, and the silence of Hattusa stands as their monument. But silence, too, can teach. Amid the fallen stones of their once great city, a message endures. Power is temporary. Harmony is eternal. In the end, the Hittites were not destroyed by their enemies, but by the slow forgetting of what once made them great. Their respect for the rhythm of nature, the sanctity of justice, and the unity of their people. Empires rise, empires fall, but the lessons of their vanishing remain, whispered through the ages by the wind that still moves across the ruins of Hattusa. In the heart of Anatolia, where the hills roll like ancient waves, and the wind still whispers through broken stone, the ruins of Hattusa stand silent. To most who wander there, it is only a ghost of history, a scatter of stones, a memory half buried by time. But to those who listen, it speaks. The city is not dead. It remembers. It remembers kings who once walked its sacred roads, their chariots gleaming beneath the sun. It remembers festivals to the storm god, prayers rising like smoke from temples of gold and limestone. It remembers the hands that carved its gates, the scribes who etched their clay tablets, and the soldiers who marched beyond its walls, believing that their empire would last forever. But all empires believe that, and all eventually face the same truth. Nothing endures, except memory. For centuries after its fall, the Hittites were erased from human recollection. Their name vanished from texts, their gods forgotten, their achievements buried beneath the soil. The world that once trembled at their power forgot they had ever lived. It was as if an entire civilization had been written out of the book of time. And yet the earth remembered what humanity did not. The stones held their secrets. The clay tablets waited patiently beneath the dust, preserving the voices of a lost world. When they were finally unearthed millennia later, they spoke with startling clarity, not just of kings and wars, but of dreams, fears, prayers, and daily life. They spoke of us. Because that is what the Hittites became, a mirror, a reflection of our own impermanence. Every monument, every empire, every digital city we build today stands on the same fragile foundation. The Hittites remind us that progress without humility is a candle burning too bright to last. Their forgotten world warns us that memory is not eternal by nature. It must be preserved by choice. When the archaeologists brushed the dust from those tablets, they did more than rediscover a people. They reawakened a truth buried in the human soul, that civilization is a dialogue across time. We speak to the past as much as it speaks to us. Each discovery, each fragment, is a thread in that conversation, connecting us not only to the Hittites, but to every hand that ever shaped the earth in the name of meaning. The rediscovery of Hattusa was not just an archaeological triumph, it was an act of remembrance. It proved that even after silence, even after centuries of oblivion, memory endures, if we choose to look for it. Today, as we face our own storms, environmental collapse, political turmoil, the fragility of connection, the story of the Hittites feels less like ancient history and more like a reflection, a reminder that what we forget, we risk repeating, that power fades, but wisdom endures, if carried forward. The stones of Hattusa no longer echo with the voices of kings, but they still speak. They whisper through time, remember us, not for our conquests, but for our fall. Learn, so that your story may end differently. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Hittites, not their empire, not their gods, not their armies, but the quiet, persistent reminder that memory itself is sacred. Because in the end, to remember is to resist oblivion, and to look into the mirror of the Hittites is to see ourselves. The echoes of the Hittites still whisper through the stones of Hattusa, reminders of a world that rose, flourished, and vanished into the dust of time. Their story is not just about an empire lost, but about humanity's eternal dance with power, faith, and survival. As we uncover these forgotten truths, we're reminded that every ruin holds a lesson, and every silence hides a voice waiting to be heard. If this journey into the lost empire of the Hittites moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth. Your curiosity keeps these stories alive. Join us next time as we explore more of history's hidden chapters, the secrets that shaped our world, and the civilizations they never wanted us to remember.